Welcome, Andrew.
Okay, thank you. So my name's Andrew Beard. As you can see from my sculpted physique, I'm a male model who also does some software architecture stuff on the side. But I'm going to go over some threat intel stuff, for lack of a better way of putting it. I don't really want to have this as a straight up presentation, because I'm not that organized, and I'd much rather, if you've got questions, please, pipe up. I like a much more conversational thing, and I really kind of set this up as conversation starters. There's a lot of stuff I don't go very deep into at all, because honestly, I don't know what people here know and what they don't know, or what they just like to talk about. So if there's something you want to dig into, please, by all means, pipe up. May ask you to stick a pin in it just for a minute if it's something that I'm going to come to a little bit later. But yeah, definitely, please let me know if there's stuff you want to talk about. So in my role, I work for a little company called NetScout that primarily does DDoS defense stuff, but we do have a fairly large threat intel team. Consists of a bunch of guys that do reverse engineering and a bunch of guys who do various tooling, run infrastructure like honeypots, IPv6 wide scanners, stuff like that. Generally, we try to generate threat intel in various forms. And when I say threat intel, I'm mainly going to talk about what I consider hard threat intel. Things that are immediately leverageable, probably a lot of talking about indicators of compromise, less about what I consider kind of soft threat intel, which is kind of more, you think of the classic write-ups with threat reports, say things like Mandiant's APT1, really cool research that you can figure out, a particular Chinese army unit is involved in a whole bunch of compromises, but attribution isn't terribly meaningful to me unless you have handcuffs or cruise missiles at your to actually do that. I have neither. So when I say threat intelligence, I'm really talking about stuff that helps you identify your adversaries and figure out what they're going to do and defend against it. Primary way of doing that, like I mentioned, is probably going to come up a lot. Call them indicators of compromise. You'll see abbreviated IOCs a lot. What an indicator of compromise is, it's something that if you find it in your environment, it's bad or potentially bad. They're usually discrete objects that are ingested by security controls. And I'll give a couple examples, but we're generally talking about things like IP addresses, domain names, hashes, things that, hey, I found this hash of this particular file. What's that file? Oh, well, this is a particular remote access Trojan executable, right? If you find that on one of your users' machines, you're probably going to have a bad day. Or really, you probably had a bad day 2 months ago, and you're just finding out about it. So most of the time, these are things that you have security controls, right? And I'm talking things like firewalls, on-host AV, or other agents that are using to scan systems, IDS systems, intrusion detection, or even just big aggregators of log files coming from things like your internal systems that are, logging things like who's logging in from where or who's doing bad things. A lot of these IOCs, they're indicators, right? They're not always conclusive by themselves. Just because I see, something from a particular IP address doesn't necessarily mean that I've been popped and that I'm really screwed. It could mean that in conjunction with 5 other things are really bad. And some particular types of IOCs aren't, terribly high efficacy. If you see if somebody visiting a particular IP address, you say, oh, holy crap, that's bad. Well, it could just be that that's a GoDaddy hosting node that has 10,000 other websites on it too, and somebody was going and looking at, I don't know, somebody who crochets website as opposed to a malware drop site. Of course, it's also possible that that person who crochets had some kind of security hole, got popped, and is now distributing some kind of really bad exploit. Not necessarily enough to tell by itself. You need some other research info or other indicators that you can kind of correlate together. So there are a lot of different types, and like I said, when I say they're of differing values, I mean, again, something that is very conclusive and very targeted is generally of higher value than something that's really vague, might be a bad thing, don't really know. That doesn't necessarily give you a lot of value. You see it in your environment, you're like, well, we could have a problem. Something that tells me, yes, we definitely have a problem. I know what it is, and more importantly, I know how to remediate it, is much, much more valuable. So one of the concepts that I like to come back to a lot is something called the pyramid of pain. This concept was originally created by a guy named David Bianco. He's actually up, I want to say he's in the DC area, because he's at a lot of the local DC area conferences. He's normally at B-Sides and a couple other things. This is called the pyramid of pain because we start kind of, that kind of works, kind of not. All right, I'm just gonna get yeah, here we go. Okay, so you can see we start kind of at the bottom of the pyramid with things that are pretty easy to collect. They're pretty easy to look for in your environment. And then as you go up the pyramid, there are things that are much harder to collect, to leverage, but also cause more pain for your adversaries. That's what the pyramid is all about. The stuff at the bottom are things that are pretty trivial for an adversary to deal with if you deny that to them. If I have a particular piece of malware that I like to use and you start scanning all of your systems for that particular piece of malware via hash, and all of a sudden now as soon as I use it I'm detected, well great, I just go and I flip one bit and now it has a totally different hash value and your defense does absolutely nothing to me. IP addresses, they're things that, all right, there's infrastructure behind that, but an IP address isn't that hard to change. You go to Amazon, you say, all right, I don't want this EC2 instance, I want a new one. You get a new IP address, no problem. As these things kind of keep going up the pyramid, then they tend to be tougher to deal with from the adversary's perspective. But they're probably also a little bit tougher for you to either find or to implement in your environment. When I was talking about controls earlier, the things that can actually use these things, generally if you've got some host AV or something like Carbon Black, you can look for hash values real easy. If you're on the network side of things, you can generally look for the hashes going past your network without too much difficulty, and God knows that you can find all sorts of hashes of malicious files floating out there. VirusTotal will tell you in an instant if something's bad or not, and you can do a lot of searches through there if you have a subscription, even a free one, and find things that are related. IP addresses generally pretty easy too, right? You got a firewall, everybody's got a firewall. Comcast will give you a freaking firewall. You can use that to block IP addresses, just black hole them, say, okay, yeah, I'm not going to let this thing anywhere near my network, no problem. Domain names, now, you start getting a little tougher. You say, all right, well.
So that's more like your umbrella and your OpenDNS kind of stuff.
Possibly, or even just something simple like a Pi-hole. Anybody who has an Active Directory setup is probably running their own DNS server internally, and it's easy to set up your own zone and say any of these things, just I'm going to resolve to NX domain, I'm going to alert on that, and if you've got some kind of logging solution, throw that in there and say, hey, look, somebody just went to this really long, complicated domain that's probably from a DGA. We'll talk about that a bit later. But yeah, I mean, you don't necessarily have to be really complicated, right? You don't even necessarily have to go commercial like Umbrella. Now, Umbrella is a good service in and of itself, and a bunch of other guys like WebRoot will provide, all sorts of filtering, things you can do. But you don't necessarily have to do anything complicated to use these things, right? Again, hash values and IP addresses, I can set semantic endpoint protection, the $30 a year version, and give it a list of things that I don't really want anywhere near my stuff. And I don't have much problem with that. So I'll come back to this later. So yeah, again, the idea here is to be as tricky as possible and to cause as much pain to, the adversary as possible, the guy who's trying to break in. We want to cause pain to them. We want to crush our enemies. We want to see them driven before us, and we want to hear the lamentations of their women. So, all this intel is great, right? We talk about all these things that you could do. So let's talk about things that you actually want to do, that are actually useful to you. And the first thing you're going to have to do is start taking a look at your environment, right? All threat hunt intel is going to start with what you have. And again, first question is, what controls do you have, or can you add? Obviously, if I do something like I have the hash, so let's say I have the SHA-1 hash of a certificate that is used in every C2 control communication for a particular strain of malware. Right? Every single one of these guys is going to have a particular signature in the X509 TLS cert. That's really awesome if you have the ability to look at all the TLS certs coming across the wire and filter out and say, this is the bad one, I want to stop that connection. Otherwise, you have a really, really nice shiny rock that you can sit on the shelf and say, I have this thing, and it does you absolutely no good. Somehow you have to be able to leverage those, and that's going to depend a lot on your capabilities. If you're talking about a home network setup, you're probably going to be a little limited. But again, things like Pi-hole, if anybody's not familiar with Pi-hole, right, it's basically a recursive DNS resolver that'll run on a little Raspberry Pi. And instead of using the DNS server that your ISP hands out, or Google 8.8.8.8, you set all of your internal systems to point to that Raspberry Pi, and then it goes and caches the results upstream. The nice thing is now that you can look at all the domains on your network that people are trying to resolve, and you can block the bad ones. A lot of people use it for blocking things like advertising websites and things like that, but there's a lot of security implications to it too, and that's actually how OpenDNS became a pretty major security player, because they said, hey, we're going to run this really fast DNS service, point all your stuff at us. And then a bunch of people did, and they're like, holy crap, we can have visibility of all this network traffic that a bunch of people don't have. How can we mine that for bad stuff? And they've got premium services now that they lay on top of it, and a bunch of other stuff, but it all kind of started with this data set that they decided to mine for threat intel. And they correlated with other data sets and things, but that was kind of their way in. So, again, what do you have available? If you've got something like, a nice shiny Palo Alto firewall, or, a Cisco ASA that has firepower services, you got some options, right? You can do things like snort rules, or I know that Palo Alto has the ability to upload their own feeds of intelligence. We'll talk a little bit about what those tend to look like. So, when it comes to your controls, you may know that you have such and such firewalls, or, maybe you've just got that Pi-hole, or you've got a Windows domain. Do some look into those and see what kind of things that they can leverage. Not everybody knows that it's pretty easy to take an Active Directory internal DNS and use that to mine your own, log all that stuff in and start mining that DNS for data, or put in your own blocks or things like that. Find out what capabilities there are that you can kind of use to insert intelligence to, because you can find some really great sources for all sorts of different indicators and threat intel, but unless you can actually use those, again, you got a pet rock. Another question, who are your adversaries? Who are you trying to protect against? You got to know your environment, and you have to know what sophistication level you reasonably are able to protect against. If you're just a home user or a small business thing, you're probably going to be worried about the lowest hanging fruit possible, right? The guys who are going to come in and, just try to bot your system so that they can use DDoS attacks or things like that. They're probably not going to target you specifically because they don't care. Your system is just as good as another guy's. Most of the time, I divide cybersecurity problems up into 3 different buckets. You know, there's the low-hanging fruit, which tends to involve a lot of Eastern European crime syndicate, you know, kind of stuff, scammers, you know, guys who will look for any target they possibly can. There are, you know, middle to advanced guys who may be looking for companies specifically, so that there's IP they can steal, but really they're kind of still out for smash and grab. And then there's like the Mossad level, you're screwed guys, where if you are in this room, there probably ain't shit you can do about those guys. Yeah. So, you know, don't go beating your head against the wall trying to protect against Mossad when, you know, really there isn't a whole lot you can do about it. You concentrate on the things that you can, because there's a cost benefit to this, right? You're going to have to do some work. You're going to have to find information. You're going to have to figure out how to leverage it, and it would be nice if all of that work actually did, you know, some good. There's a boogeyman complex in cybersecurity, right? Everybody sees all these very, how can I say, very fantastic stories about all of these advanced, you know, cybersecurity attacks, and those are the things that my mother tends to call me up about and says, like, hey, I heard that there was like this attack on this power plant in Russia, and they're thinking it might have been, you know, these guys, and they're saying all this stuff about black energy. How do I make sure my phone doesn't get infected with that? You know, it's one of those things like, okay, well, did you patch it? All right, great, you're done. You know, be concerned about the things that are actually have a reasonable chance of infecting you, because the weird stuff that involves like security vulnerabilities where, you know, it requires a gamma ray to reflect off something, and on the 3rd Wednesday of, you know, whatever, then maybe you can buffer overflow into this very thing. If it's targeted specifically at you, it probably isn't going to happen. What's probably going to happen is that the secretary is going to click on an email, and you know, all of a sudden her system's going to get infected with Dereza, and then they're going to start downloading Bitcoin miners all over your environment, and people are going to say, shit's really slow today. You know, that's the stuff that's much easier to defend against. There's information about it all over, because those kind of adversaries are generally not the ones who are trying to be stealthy. So, you know, they're the ones that you just got to be a little bit better than the other guy to defend against. So consider that kind of cost-benefit analysis. So I'm going to start with some free Intel sources and just show you kind of what they look like, because I think once you do see them, it gets a little bit easier to understand how you'd actually use some of them. These are kind of some of my favorites. Bambanek Consulting, actually run by a guy that I used to work with named John Bambanek, produced some good feeds. Let me see, I'm going to try popping this up here. I don't know if this is going to show up on the WebEx. If it doesn't, please let me know. Oh, cool, it's not even going to show up on the other display. So that's going to make stuff way harder. So I'm going to, how do I tell it to stop the slideshow for a sec? Bear with me one sec. Okay, where's my slideshow controls? All right, we're just going to end slideshow for a sec. All right, that's a little bit better. So just for example, this is one of his feeds, right? And you can see here that I'll kind of go through some examples of this stuff later. Oh, cool, my browser is totally locked. Most of the time, you know,
Can I see that on the web?
I don't know. If you guys can't, please let me know. I thought I had told it just to share my entire screen and not just that, so hopefully they can.
I think it is the way it is.
It's still showing.
It's not. I'm following it in my browser too. So.
Okay, cool. So I'm looking at the Bambanek DGA feeds, and I'll get into DGAs and how those work a little bit later. But this is just an example of some old CryptoLocker domains. And they're technically old, but nobody's really worried about this generation of CryptoLocker anymore. a lot of this stuff is just distributed as CSV files, right? Comma-separated values where, hey, there's some indicator, maybe it's an IP, maybe it's a domain, maybe it's a hash value, and, some info about it. Because, honestly, it's really easy to ingest these things. And a lot of times people do, like, some Python code as kind of glue, so they want a pretty simple format to load in. So this is just the example of a domain that if you see it in your environment, you can see here, that doesn't look like a normal domain, right? That doesn't look like something which somebody is going to probably be typing in and legitimately want to go to that site, unless, like, maybe they're a cat or something. But, I mean, the likelihood of randomly hitting on this domain is pretty bad. And it looks weird for a reason. Like I said, I'll get into that in a little bit. But if you saw something like that in your environment, you can reasonably say, that's weird. Maybe I should look at the guy who visited the site if I'm monitoring the domain requests and possibly start looking and seeing if it's being hit by CryptoLocker. Maybe I should see, if they received any funny emails. Maybe I should see if there are, my host-based antivirus is complaining about anything from that particular guy. Because if I see this in combination with that stuff, you can bet I'm going to be pulling that machine off the network and taking a real close look at it before, it goes back on and possibly tries to laterally infect some other systems. But most of the stuff is very similar kind of things. Let's see, I'm going to go over here to another one. Abuse.ch is a really nice Swiss resource that has a whole ton of different feeds available. And again, these are just examples. Abuse has a really nice one they call the SSL blacklist. I was mentioning before, being able to identify particular SHA-1 hashes of SSL connections. Right. If you're not familiar with TLS certificates, if I go up here and right now I've got an SSL connection to this particular server, I can say, hey, show me the certificate. Every system every SSL system that I'm connecting to has a certificate that it presents to me, and that is supposed to identify it, pretty uniquely. So you can actually go through here and see the hash values. Normally it's the same thing as the thumbprint here. So this is just the certificate used by this particular site. A lot of C2 servers have pretty specific certificates that they use. So again, if I see this certificate in use here, or really a network connection that uses the certificate, then I'm probably going to start looking to see if the host that was connecting to it may have this particular malware strain.
So it's interesting because back in the day we were always told, well, make sure it's got a certificate because then it's secure.
So I have
it's safe.
I have a shirt that has a lock on it, and it says, "This means that you can give me your credit card numbers."
Right.
That's about the same level of security.
But you remember that? You remember? I mean, that was a big thing, right?
Yeah.
We told everybody, if you saw the lock, it's okay. Go ahead and you can give them your credit card numbers, right?
Yeah, that just means that no one's going to be able to get it in transit.
Right.
That means it says absolutely nothing about the
validity of the person
it's
on
like,
the other side,
all right,
right?
I'm talking to you, right? And the lock means that you can't intercept the thing. That's cool. You may still be a dick. Yeah, it's like, all this stuff, this site is semantic verified, that's great. It's like, cool, that just means you can give them the money. That doesn't mean that they're not going to steal your money. It's the exact same complex.
I love it.
So, yeah, SSL has changed a lot in the past 5 years or so, 10 years. It used to be, it was hard to get a certificate. You had to do all this stuff to get it verified. Now it's like, oh, no, I'm just going to go to one of these. Yeah, Let's Encrypt will just give you a free one for 6 months. Who cares? Unless even if you've got one of those, what do they call them, like the level 2 certificates where they have the identity verification stuff.
Right, yeah.
Okay, yeah, still could mean the guy's a dick. Insane. So, in any event, there are a lot of different sites which will distribute, and there are thousands and thousands of different ones. But you also got to realize that these are I I know John Bambanek. I don't know these Swiss guys. You know, these are some random guys on the internet who are telling you things are bad. You know, do you trust that? You know, there is a lot of efficacy issues which come down from, all right, you know, I've heard every once in a while, people on the internet are wrong. I don't know if you guys are down with that or not, but just because something is, they're saying, yeah, something's bad, and this one in particular, Alien Bald OTX. Okay.
How would you collect the SSL signatures there? Like what software would you be using that would tell you one of your, I understand for the IP addresses of the domains, you get from like your firewall or whatever. Where would you get like, oh, hey, I see one of my machines talking to this SSL?
Personally, I would use Bro or Suricata.
Okay.
I don't know if you're familiar with Bro at all, and I can totally talk your ear off about Bro. It's an open source, basically, it's been considered an IDS for a long time, but it's really just a network traffic analysis system.
Okay.
And it will generate log files from live traffic that say, hey, this connection here, you know, had these attributes, and the SSL certificate is one of them.
Okay.
It'll extract the whole certificate if you want to. Suricata can actually do something very similar. If you really want to, you can pipe those into, you know, a SIM, what we were talking about, you know, at a fairly recent meeting, or something like Elasticsearch if you have a shit ton of RAM, or Splunk if you have a shit ton of money.
So network monitoring.
Yeah.
Well, like a security onion is probably, in my opinion, is probably one of the basics that you can like dip your foot in the pool with Bro and Suricata. You can make the decision there, but it offers both sides of that coin. So if you want to kind of dip your foot in the pool, I suggest Security Onion, and then it bundles in addition to Bro or Suricata, it bundles in some other things that makes it with Elasticsearch so that you can actually kind of get a front end to that whole infrastructure. And are you guys still using Security Onion?
Yeah, we just went to the latest version that has the elk stack. It's free, open source, and the way they've got it set up, if you just want to run it at your house, you can have it up and running in 15 minutes. All you have to do is it has to be able to sniff traffic on the network. So you just buy a little, you know, $50 tap or whatever, mirror port off of switch or something.
Yeah, and actually, if people are interested in that afterwards, I'll go through some examples. I might be able to VPN into my system at home to show what that looks like. But there are also some really cheap, like micro-tick managed switches that you can use for like no problem, no worries. But yeah, and that all falls under that security controls category, right? You gotta kind of know what you have available or what you can implement easily. And, you know, like I said before, it's going to require some work to be able to leverage this stuff. Some of that may be, all right, you know, I'll Security Onion on an Intel NUC, and I'll start looking at the traffic and, you know, see what I get. So, yeah, whenever you're looking at an Intel source, you got to ask yourself some questions. And I'm really, you know, I'm kind of generalizing a bit here, but just think about these kind of things when when you're considering if something's going to be useful, if it's worth implementing, or, you know, if it's more pain than it's worth. One is, you know, can I actually observe this thing? And you know, this is kind of like to your question. What's good as a feed of SSL certificates if I have no visibility into my SSL certificates? I want stuff I can actually use. You know, how much information do you have about the things? Can you narrow it down to a part of your environment? For example, you know, saying an IP address is bad is one thing, but you say, hey, this IP address is bad because they are trying to scan for SQL injection vulnerabilities, something like that. So if this thing is communicating with your SQL, with servers that may have database connections coming to them, then all of a sudden I don't need to worry about this affecting every desktop in my environment. It's really just pointed at my server farm. That's really kind of important too, because there tends to be a lot of back and forth with directionality of certain things. You know, am I worried about this particular thing coming inbound into my environment? Am I worried about somebody in my environment visiting this site because it has a drive-by exploit? That kind of helps you identify, should I care about this everywhere? Should I care about it somewhere? Good example, is everybody familiar with NTP and pool.ntp.org? Okay. I know I see some head nodding, I see some head shaking, so NTP is a network time synchronization protocol, right? When you say, I want to set my clock via the internet, it's probably talking out to some system over NTP. And there's a pool of public NTP servers available. And when you connect to pool.ntp.org, you generally get one of them, one of any number of thousands. Some of those systems are in that pool because they're trying to gather information about people. Because anyone can join the pool and all of a sudden get connections from anywhere. So there are definitely some malware C2 sites that have an active presence in the NTP pool. If I notice an outbound connection to one of those sites, you know, and you do often if you're using certain blacklists and you're looking for certain information, first thing I look for is, was it on port 123, which is the port NTP uses? Because if I have some valid system connecting to the NTP pool and it's only talking over NTP, then it's probably more okay than some oddball, weird binary connection that's using an unsigned certificate or something like that I may think is more screwy. So threat actors will definitely try to hide in the noise. So anything they can do to get an air of legitimacy, they'll do that. So that particular trick or something is generally considered something like a TTP, right? Hey, you know, this is, TTP is tactics, tools, and procedures. And that's generally up towards the top of the pyramid, right? We know that this particular actor likes to put his systems into the pool so that you get a deluge of alerts and eventually you just say, oh, screw it, ignore all this stuff. And then all of a sudden you start missing the good stuff when things start connecting on not NTP ports. So why? How do I know if something's bad? Is there a motive involved? Not a motive, a motive. Why somebody telling you that something is bad doesn't necessarily make it so, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's bad for you. You generally always want to try to get information that comes from sources that are as close to you as possible. What I mean is, if you're a bank, and you probably want good information would be, what kind of attacks are other banks seeing? There are industry groups like FSISAC, with financial services, information, something, can't remember exactly what the acronym is, but it's basically it's a information sharing group, particularly for financial services, because they see a lot of attacks that Bank of America and Chase, you know, you'll see guys that attack all of them. Why? Because banks have money and criminals like money. But, you know, again, if you're a small business, you probably want information, you know, about other small businesses. If you're a Fortune 500 company, it probably would help you to find targeting information about other Fortune 500s. If you're an industrial sector, you probably want information about guys that are, you know, targeting other production facilities or, we'll say, you know, that may have certain industrial controls, things like Modbus, protocol things. Those are things that, you know, for example, I'm trying to think of a good one, Microsoft probably isn't going to have. You know, they don't really need to worry about those particular things. So having good intel, if it is from someone who's so diametrically different from you that they see a completely different class of attacks, may not necessarily be all that useful. You know, it's really easy to collect a lot of hashes and IPs and all this good stuff. You know, you can collect millions and billions of them, but eventually when it comes down to it, you probably want to keep an active set of things you're looking for, because most devices don't tend to deal well with looking with billions and billions of different things.
So,
Go
where
ahead.
do you see the MITRE attack matrix in all of this? Am I getting ahead of the, am I? getting ahead
You're
of
talking about like attack and actually I get into that in a little bit
Okay,
when I start
then
talking about Styx
I'll-
taxi.
yeah.
I tend to see those more as kind of TTPs and information kind of going up there because when it comes down to it, all of that tends to be stuff that kind of dresses up additional info. That's kind of metadata or labeling about
Yes.
something that I, you know, if it's hard intel, right? There's a lot of good soft intel about that that's very usable. But yeah, let me stick a pin in that and get to that a little bit later because I could talk about that, but I have a feeling that without a little context, I may lose a lot of people. When is really important, there's a lot of stuff out there that hasn't really been active for years. Botnets in particular get taken down all the time. I really don't want to be looking for 1,000 domains a day for Dereza when, you know, the Dereza botnet got taken down by a law enforcement like 4 years ago. It's probably not of super high value if there are maybe, you know, 5,000 systems in the world that are still infected with a particular thing. Maybe look for it once, and you probably aren't going to keep getting infected by that stuff. Look at things that tend to be recent and tend to be relevant. You know, time's a sliding window, and eventually the old stuff, you know, isn't probably necessarily going to be a problem. You know, we don't necessarily look for configure anymore for good reason. And again, the targeting stuff, this kind of comes back to that, you know, don't try to defend against Mossad if you're really not going to be someone who Mossad is going to take interest in. My mother really doesn't have to worry about Black Energy infecting her iPhone. You know, what are they going to do? Get, you know, her daughter's phone number? I mean, they don't care. So, you know, always just kind of think about the stuff that you're getting, is it useful to you? You know, just kind of make sure it passes a certain sniff test because you can get a lot of good stuff. I know a lot of people who, well, and I used to be involved in the DIB, the Defense Industrial Base, especially guys working a couple hours north of here. That's all great, but that data is generally pretty limited usefulness outside of particular companies that may be targeted by foreign nation states. You know, Target, may not necessarily care. A lot of commercial providers of threat intel. I went through some open source ones. You know, always some providers are better than others, and if you're looking at data from one of them, ask lots of questions. Ask them where they get their stuff. Ask them, because I know of a couple of providers in particular who really just aggregate and scrape some of those open source sites that I mentioned earlier, ball it together, and then sell it for their products in particular, and charge a whole lot of money for that. You know, compare it to some of those open source feeds and making sure you're actually getting your money's worth out of it, and that you're actually, if you are thinking about paying them, paying for original content. Also, make sure you understand how a provider expects you to use that data. Like, for example, there's one company in particular that we were talking to where we evaluated some of their stuff. Oh yeah, you know, just download our feed, it's great, you know. And they said, well, how do we know it's good? You know, what do you do about false positives? Oh, we update every 15 minutes, so everything on here is really good. Like, so that just means you can pull it out really good, but in those 15 minutes, like, am I gonna get flooded with alerts? Answer was yes. They also said, well, you're using our feed wrong because you're using it to look at outbound traffic, people going to other sites. This is only for server protection. This is for, you know, things that if you have we deal with firewalls on the incoming side. So if you have a server, these are things that you should be blocking before they get to you at all. You know, their use case was much different than what we thought it was. So make sure you understand what the provider says the use case is and that it actually fits your environment, because you can kind of twist yourselves into knots. And a lot of times, you know, the answer may just be, yeah, this isn't a good fit for us, this doesn't work. There are lots of other guys out there who are more than willing to take your money. So I'll talk really briefly about tips. So, you know, threat intelligence, there are all these different feeds, there are all these different providers, there's all this money that people are willing to spend on it. So let's add one more product that you can spend some money on that basically takes all this stuff, aggregates it together, and shoves it into your boxes. The idea for a tip is where it's going to take all this data, munge it up, maybe convert it. You know, I showed you that CSV file earlier that had all these different indicators in it. You know, what if you need to reformat that slightly so that your Fortinet firewall can understand something, or, you know, maybe it doesn't like IP addresses individually. Maybe they have to be CIDR blocks. You know, it'll do reformatting for that. Maybe that particular Fortinet firewall really doesn't like when you have a block list that has duplicates in it, and two providers try to tell you the same IP address is bad because they're getting their data from the exact same source. You know, the idea behind a tip is take all this stuff, aggregate it together, and make one kind of flow of content back to your devices. You know, some of them also allow you to enrich that data, maybe adding things like GeoIP lookups or ASN numbers or information that can be garnered about them, who is info, things that make life easier when you're trying to investigate. You know, I saw this in my environment, how bad is this? So another thing I'd like to talk about, Styx and Taxi, and I'm going to open up an example here. Styx, Taxi are relatively new, and when I say relatively, I guess they've still been around for almost 11 years now. They're really awesome formats, they're really flexible, and they're really a pain in the butt. The idea was, hey, you know, everybody's using these flat files, these CSVs to distribute stuff, but all you get are these little description fields, and there isn't much about it. We need a flexible format where we can really express a lot of info about them. We need to be able to express complex relationships besides just individual indicators. I want to be able to tell you that this particular domain was used by this threat actor, and it was observed attacking or in, say, whitehouse.gov on this particular date, and that it is related to a particular stage of infection. You know, say this was used not to scan the network initially, but this was used as an exploit because it was downloaded by this other thing. You know, very complicated relationships that are the kind of things that analysts will normally write down in a notebook. We want to represent this in a machine-readable format. I'm going to open this guy. Actually, I think I already have this guy up. So, yeah, here we go. Styx is a really nice format for those really kind of complicated scenarios, but it does get, we'll say, a little verbose. So Styx has two different versions. The 1.0 version, or the 1.x version, was all XML based. The newer version, Styx 2.x, is all JSON based, and tends to involve a lot of GUIDs to try to identify these things. But here you can see that this is a malicious site, right? This is a URL. Rather than just a CSV with one particular URL in it, you get a, how big? Almost 50 lines of JSON, but you tend to get a lot more info, like, hey, this is the site that was hosting a downloader, and it was hosting a backdoor with a remote access Trojan, and this is the cycle and the kill chain. And this kind of gets to the point that you were talking about earlier, right? How does this fit in when you're talking about attack patterns and trying to describe threat modeling stuff? Styx tends to be the format that was kind of developed, and everyone's kind of pushed towards representing that stuff in there. So, it's a great format and it allows you to do this stuff. Unfortunately, the complexity is also kind of its downfall. It's a lot of work to prep an indicator, to get all this information and put it in here. And there aren't a whole lot of threat intel providers who will give you this amount of detail into what they're doing, because most of them just want to sell you stuff to shove in your firewall. So I know a number of companies use Styx internally to represent their stuff, and then kind of strip that down into a feed that they will provide externally, or a lot of threat exchange groups. I know the Cyber Threat Alliance in particular, their new platform is entirely Styx and Taxi based. And they will give you a whole great amount of info, and you can look at all the different providers that are submitting to them, which include Palo Alto and Cisco and all those guys, but they won't give you that level of intel unless you're actively part of that industry group. There's a lot of closed groups where information is exchanged. A lot of times they're called fight clubs. You don't talk about Fight Club.
Right.
Where some of them may revolve around particular botnets or particular industry groups. Like I mentioned, FSISAC. I know there was one in particular that was involved in the takedown of, I can't remember which botnet it was. But that involved a lot of law enforcement, FBI, Microsoft, a concentrated effort to, we knew Dyn DNS was also a big part of it, because Dyn was what they would use to generate all their domains. And there was a concentrated action by all of those guys to, learn what they could, and then in the span of about 48 hours did a pretty massive takedown for all of them together. So a lot of them will use a format like this to exchange data. But again, when you have something this verbose, this is a nice format for exchanging all this stuff. There aren't a whole lot of security products, though, which allow you to just randomly take in a Styx blob and actually expect it to.
How do you ingest this?
And that's kind of the problem, because Styx and Taxi, I don't remember if they have like an advanced example of using like the pattern matching stuff. I don't think they do. Some of this stuff, there's no way that an automated product is going to be able to do anything about it. Like this one identifies a particular threat actor. What's a firewall going to do with that?
Yeah, I mean, you're going to have to custom script and create something to be able to actually ingest and use that, right?
Well, something like this, I know a number of products that will ingest it, and then it will say 0 usable indicators found, done. Because honestly, how, Disco Team. My firewall now knows about Disco Team. Awesome. It knows that they like to steal credit card data. Yeah. My firewall going to do about it, This in and of itself. So Styx has the ability to be so complicated that it doesn't actually have useful information. It tries to be
back to this MITRE attack matrix, where it's got so much metadata attached with it that you're kind of like, thanks for the info, but...
Yeah, then what? Yeah, well, that's when things start becoming more to that soft, that what I consider soft intel rather than hard intel. Hard intel to me is things I can leverage, things I can leverage in an automated way. And there are definitely ways to represent that in Styx and Taxi. Again, that URL was a good example of something like that, but that was 50 lines of JSON to present one usable URL indicator. I'm not saying that that's bad. I'm just saying, you got to parse through a lot of stuff to get what you want, and there's a whole lot of stuff there, which is definitely going to be useful to some people, but Styx tries to be everything to everyone, and unfortunately, it ends up being nothing to some people, like firewalls. So, it's a lot of times if you're just looking up threat intel and you're trying to get it, you'll say, oh yeah, everybody should be using Styx and Taxi. It's great, it can do all this stuff. But you got to be real careful about it, because I could buy a feed of Styx indicators from a provider, and then find out that there's nothing in there that I can actually use with my devices pretty easily. So again, great, you just got to make sure, go back to those original questions, what are the use cases, what can I do with it, and try stuff out. So I'm going to go through a quick little, what I'm going to call a case study, and really is just an example. All right. So imagine for a sec that you're in your kind of chosen environment, right? And you're looking at different types of intel. I can hand you different types of intel, and you can think, what can I do with that? Or what does that get me? What doesn't it get me? So, and all of this intel ends up being related, right? So I can say, okay, I have information about this particular strain of malware, and I got it by looking at these particular executables. Here are the hashes of these executables, right? So you can go into your Carbon Black system or your AV and you say, all right, I know about all these things, and all of these, and I can block these, or I can at least flag them as bad. So now, whenever that pops onto my individual hosts, I can say, all right, I'm protected against this thing. Well, no, not really, because then you find out, well, this guy is generating this malware. He generates about 1 million samples per day. Maybe he has an automated builder and he just uses a random number and appends that to the end of all his binaries, and he sends them out in spam. So those hashes, okay, great, you're protected against those, but your coverage still kind of sucks. You're still going to get hit by other ones. All right, so I say, all right, let's forget about hashes for a sec. What if I gave you a bunch of IP addresses of his C2 servers? Okay, great. You say, all right, I can put this in my firewall, and I can block all of these IP addresses, and I'm good to go. And then you say, well, yeah, but these are IP addresses that have actually been used, and when he pops up, his command and control servers, they're really only up for maybe an hour at a time. So the usefulness of that IP address, its lifespan is an hour. And after that, you never see it again. Or still, you see it again, but they're up at Amazon EC2, and now they're, some Norwegian bachelor farmer's website or something, and you blocked that, and now the CEO is really pissed because that's his brother. Okay, so you say, all right, well, okay, IP addresses are bad. What about domain names? I can give you a whole bunch of domain names, and you can block those guys. You say, okay, great, cool. We can do that, and if you find out that the domain names actually lead the IP addresses, right? Some of those domain names aren't registered yet. So if you register one, then it's bad. Okay, great. You say, well, all right, so we're doing better now, except he generates these domain names every day, and he generates 1,000 of them. And if it gets registered, then you're sure you're going to block them. But you have 1,000 new domains a day, and that's, it's a little unwieldy. Say, okay, well, what if I give you the algorithm that he uses to generate those domains? I say that every day he takes a date, the current date, and he generates really funny looking domains. And again, think back to those domains that we saw from the Bambinet consulting feed, right? The ones with all sorts of random characters, and they look funny, and they didn't look like normal stuff. That's because those particular domains are actually generated by an algorithm. And, maybe it's seeded by date, maybe it's seeded by other ones. There are some, I think, not Corebot, but there are definitely some that use other information, like they'll pull down the current currency exchange rate for some really obscure currency instead of the date, and they'll use that as the seed to their generation algorithm. Because really all it needs to know is that right now, my infected machine can get some data to figure out the same domain that I know to register, and no one else does. But now, if I learn the algorithm, now, okay, I can generate my own domains every day. I know when they're going to expire, so I don't need to track more than the current day's worth. I can even generate them into the future. So I know that next week, if this thing pops up, that's bad. More importantly, now if my adversary, right, is going to rework this, he's now got to rework all of his malware samples, because every one of those right now probably uses the same domain or generation algorithm, and he's got to, rework that and redistribute new samples and do all sorts of stuff. Okay, so now the DGA is, now we're talking about higher parts of the pyramid, right? We've gone from simple domain names to now we're talking about, network, really, I'd say network host artifacts. Sometimes that would be considered tools. But I know now how my adversary works. I know, every day he does this thing, every day his malware does this thing, and now that I understand the relationship between those, I can kind of mess with his plans. And I can do it in a way that's really going to require some work on his part. Now, it's going to require some work on my part too, because obviously I have to re-implement that algorithm in some piece of code and then have that injected into, my firewall or whatever. But if I'm willing to do that, then I can screw with him. And then, that certificate attributes. So this is one that I actually did some research on a couple of years ago. We're talking about those certificate fingerprints, right? And this is one that I just kind of like to show off because it's funny. We were talking about those certificates. We said you can use a hash, and much like the hashes of malware, right? You can regenerate these, without too much difficulty, especially if it's a self-signed cert or one from Let's Encrypt. I'm just going to register it again, and I get a new fingerprint. Yay! But there are free-form text fields in here, like the subject. Yeah, I didn't mean to do that at all. Where's the subject info? Here we go. Things like the issuer, things like the subject. Now, normally, here we go. This one belongs to GitHub Incorporated, and it's, San Francisco. Now, all of these are free-form text. Somebody can spoof it. That's not that big of a deal. But we noticed a couple of years ago that most malware authors really can't spell very well. And they will include weird shit in here that just doesn't make any sense and no one would put here. Particularly, we had one of them who, what was it? He kept using the wrong locations for cities, like putting them together with the wrong state. So we're just like, so he just always uses the same combination of like, I forget what it was. It was like San Francisco in Maryland or something like that. And it's like, so if I just look for any certificate with San Francisco in Maryland, how many actual legitimate ones do I come up with? None. And he would go and he would keep registering these things, not realizing that people had kind of discovered that particular pattern. And, what they don't know can cause them to bang against their head against the wall, which, again, causes them pain, which makes me happy. So, things like that, you start getting into network and host artifacts and various attributes. When you find something kind of unique like that, that isn't in, we'll say, necessarily the normal playbook, then that tends to cause them a great deal of irritation, I'll say. Doing okay with time. I will say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. There's a lot of, I talked a little bit about how you can use this stuff in good ways, but always kind of try stuff out first. It's really easy to say, all right, I'm gonna take this great feed of all this really bad stuff because somebody said it's bad, and I'm gonna apply it in my environment, and now you've got a bunch of really pissed off users because they can't do anything useful. Always, it's really easy to get into well, this stuff is bad. I just want to block it all, right? I want to do less work. Try running this stuff in an alerting mode, first, and try it on a clean pipe of traffic. I generally have on all of our systems just a pipe of traffic coming in from like accounting or some group of users who don't do weird techie shit. because if things start flagging on them immediately, I know that something's wrong, right? I consider that my clean stuff. Maybe take a PCAP of traffic or stuff like that and just run it through as kind of a quick smoke test and say, all right, I just ended up with 10,000 alerts for weird stuff. Something's going wrong here. Don't immediately put stuff into block mode because you will find every false positive in there really quickly.
We had a security engineer company-wide block Google on port 80.
Ooh. I had an analyst who was
Fun day.
I had an analyst who was doing a reverse engineering job, and he found out that they had a C2 server running on a site that they had registered Pinterest.co, not com. But he put in a pattern into the feed for it, and he messed it up a little bit because he meant to do Pinterest.co/star. He accidentally did Pinterest.co star, Pinterest.block2, and at the time, my clean feed traffic was my home network, and my wife was so pissed off. But it was a good smoke test, right? It was like, all right, if the muggles are bad things, then I can
free time on Saturday though.
Make sure your data is trustworthy. Make sure you're getting it from where you think you are, and that the people who are giving you stuff are actually deserving of that position. You're taking stuff from them and putting it directly in your environment, and in a lot of cases that it may be analogous to taking a random thumb drive that you found and plugging it into your computer and just running every executable on it, right? You are giving someone else potentially a privileged position in your network. Make sure you understand what that means, and always verify before you overreact. I did have one guy I worked with who was absolutely convinced that a small MSSP was like getting hacked by Chinese nationals or something like that, and it turned out that he had just set some routing stuff wrong, and everything was being routed through like the Chinese CDN side of the house. So just always, if some stuff may like throw a giant flag in your face and saying, holy crap, this is bad, just calm down, take a breath, and just verify that before you go off running to the CISO saying, holy crap,
We've seen something similar to that, where we had devices that were making all these calls out to China. What the heck? Turns out somebody had just misconfigured the DNS calls. So misconfigured DNS, and so they put in an extra one, and now it's trying to resolve all its DNS queries to China. Okay.
Yeah. Don't trust but verify.
Right.
So that's pretty much all the stuff that I had that I wanted to talk to you. Like I said, I really did this more for like Q&A, and if anybody has questions or things they want to dig into further, more than happy to talk about it. Yeah, that's pretty much what I got.